Democrats decided not to duke it out in a primary for governor this year, and that means Dr. Tom Sherman, a physician and state senator, has secured the nomination and a clear path to focus on the incumbent, Governor Chris Sununu, from now until November. Dr. Sherman is our guest this morning in studio. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Adam.
So let's talk about the high cost of energy. It's possible that if you are taking office in January, we could be in a crisis where people are spending huge chunks of their savings just to heat their homes, and some people might even be freezing in those homes. So if you're in that corner office, what's your plan?
So let's just go back a sec. This is a governor who has bounced from crisis to crisis. Whether it's the housing crisis, opioid crisis, mental health crisis, this is yet another Sununu crisis. And the way I would do it is completely different from the way he does things. Both as a doctor and as a legislator, I have always reached out to leadership across the aisle and also to rank and file members of the legislature to get things done. And problem solving is something that I've done throughout my career, both as a doctor and as a legislator. So fundamentally, what I would do, first thing, is to sit down with leadership in the House and the Senate and make sure that we have both a short-term and a long-term path forward. Sununu could have avoided much of this had he not vetoed so many bills back when the rates were low and the prices were low, and we could actually do this effectively. That was in 2019. He didn't. He chose not to. And all of those efforts, by the way, were bipartisan. Republican leadership was fully on board with those, and Sununu chose to veto them anyway. That leaves us vulnerable now. So we need to work with both Democratic and Republican leadership in the legislature, who I'm very comfortable with, having been both in the House and the Senate, and create that short-term and long-term approach. Short-term, providing property tax relief. That's where we can really decrease some of the overhead that people are feeling. We can also work with the PUC to say, is there a way to mitigate some of this shock, the sticker shock? Because they do have a right to phase in higher prices. They do have a right to say, maybe we don't hit the consumer so hard right now, but we put it out over time. And then in the long term, we broaden our base of energy sources.
When you talk about doing that, transitioning to a green energy, more, solar, more wind, things like that, isn't that transition going to ultimately cost consumers more, at least in the short term?
No, what's costing consumers more right now is failure 3 years ago when we had an option, when rates were low, to actually invest in the future. Sununu chose not to. He has been very tightly aligned with the fossil fuel industry, and he has put us in a place where we are so dependent on natural gas and that market that we're dependent on it. We don't have the same array of energy sources that our neighboring states do.
Let's talk a little bit about gun policy. We know where you stand from your time in the state Senate, that you would support, expanded background checks, a red flag law, a wait period. But how much farther do you think the state should go to prevent gun violence? Do you think the state should repeal something? Would you sign a repeal of the Stand Your Ground law, for instance?
This is New Hampshire, and I respect the right of people to bear arms. That's a Second Amendment right. I'm not taking their guns. I do believe there is consensus, broad consensus, both across the state and across the country, that there are some fundamental bills that we can put in place, many of which are covered by the recent federal law. But on the same day that was signed into law, Sununu signed a bill that would make those unenforceable by our own law enforcement. Our law enforcement thought that bill was irresponsible, and the governor signed it anyway. So imagine if you're a young parent with your child in school, and federal protections for that school can't be enforced by the state of New Hampshire. That's what Sununu did. That's not common sense. That's not listening to the people of New Hampshire. That has to change.
What about Stand Your Ground? Would you repeal it?
No, not at this point.
How about licensing for AR-15 style rifles?
Not at this point.
And do you think New Hampshire has a healthy gun culture?
I'm not sure. As a physician, all of the medical societies in the country, including our own, have said that there is an appropriate use and ownership of guns, and then there is the public health imperative, which is suicide, domestic violence, and mass shootings. That's not healthy. So do hunters use it? They get out in the woods with their kids and have a great family event? Yes. But we have to address the other side of the gun issue, which is safety and violence reduction.
On law enforcement reform, would you support repealing qualified immunity for police officers?
On law enforcement, I have a great relationship with my chiefs. In fact, I helped the chief in Stratham with the accreditation process. I have always been supportive. And what I would support for my law enforcement in the state of New Hampshire, and they know this, would be making sure they have all the tools they need. That means possibly broadening their tools to include social services, broadening or formalizing some of the links they have with area agencies that are dealing with domestic violence, and especially in places like Manchester and Nashua, where there are issues of language and diversity, making sure that they have all the tools they need to be able to reach across to those communities and connect with them.
How about on abortion? If you're governor, what legislation do you want to see on your desk first? And would you want to repeal the 24-week abortion ban?
I would want to put in place Roe versus Wade in the state of New Hampshire. We actually almost got there in the Senate. One of our senators brought that. We all co-sponsored it. We had 2 Republican votes joining us, so it was a 12-12 tie, which means it failed. We were so close. The people of New Hampshire do not want the state in between a doctor and a patient, especially on such an intensely personal and private issue like abortion.
What about repealing the 24-week ban?
The issue is really the criminalization after 24 weeks. And if Roe versus Wade were put in place, we wouldn't need the 24-week ban because it covers that. That's been the law of the country for the last 50 years. So we make it a state-based statute. We put it as a protection, and that protects us from anything the federal government might do to try to do an abortion ban across New Hampshire.
Do you believe there's any point in a pregnancy at which the fetus should have a right to life?
I think Roe versus Wade recognizes viability. I think there are also exceptions which have to do with the woman's, whether the woman can even survive. And some of the states in the country, as you know, have put in such tight restrictions that a woman's life may be in jeopardy because of the inability to terminate the pregnancy. So we need to let the doctors and the women work together to make those incredibly tough personal decisions.
Can you name one issue or policy area on which you would stand up to the Biden administration?
I think the most important area where we need to be thinking is how do we bring down prices? So it's not really standing up, it's that I would shift their policy to make sure that we are doing everything we possibly can on inflation. Now, that's not a state issue. So it's not really my place. I think that's more the place of the federal delegation. We know that. That's something that we've seen, the federal delegation working with the Biden administration. But at the state level, I really don't have a role to stand up against the Biden administration. On the other hand, I have a very strong role making sure the people of New Hampshire can survive, can live in the state they love, can continue to do that in spite of what's happening nationally or internationally.
If the DNC decides to take away New Hampshire's first in the nation primary status, what would be the practical impact for Democrats running up and down the ballot?
I don't think this is something that at this point I believe we deserve the first in the nation status. I believe we should fight hard for the first in the nation status. It has worked really well, and we were first with this whole process. So I would make a strong argument with the DNC that that is not something that they should be doing. But I don't think that, actually, I don't want to speculate because I think that we can hold on to the first in the nation status.
Right, but here they are putting this on the table for you. You know, it may not go away this time, but certainly it's going to be a conversation in the future.
Well, I will fight as hard as I possibly can to keep it here because I think it's part of what makes New Hampshire, New Hampshire, and I think it's also New Hampshire has voters who understand who people are, they get engaged, they get involved, and that's why whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, I've been able to win in a Republican district because people vote for the person. And I know that when people get to know me, when they realize what Sununu has done or has not done, they will choose me as their next governor.
Nate Silver at 538 gives you a 1 in 100 chance of winning this race. It's pretty stark.
That's the pundits. I can't go with that. I'm here to run this race until November and make sure people know who I am, and also really know that the governor has put in place the first abortion ban. He's attacking our public schools and our public school teachers. He's really attacking, he's shifted and taken the state so far off track that some people are afraid that if he continues in office, they won't recognize it. I won't do that. I will listen to the people of New Hampshire. I understand New Hampshire, and I will make sure that that trust is intact at the end of my being governor.
All right, Dr. Tom Sherman, thanks for joining us on Close Up.
Thank you
We'll see
so
you out
much.
there on the trail.